What's up, creeps? I just finished the Burning Con Dickson Carr. I power read today about 85 pages, something like that. This is a 215-page book, and John Dickson Carr is one of the premier murder mystery writers of days ago. And there was a guy on Facebook that I know that recommended John Dickson Carr, and I never read any of his books before, but I asked him for a recommendation on which titles to get, and I bought a stack of it looks like 6 books on eBay for like $15. And there was a couple in that list that he recommended I start with. This was one of them. And of course, this has a half naked chick on it. So how could I not pick this one? Um, yeah, the cover is quite interesting. And the premise that was on the front of it, too, is interesting. She worshiped evil and made murder her religion. So that sounded different. And it was quite different. So looking up the background, this guy as Agatha Christie and Perry Mason and all those guys have a usual investigator like Perot or Perry Mason himself are always kind of like the lead investigator in the books. In this particular book, there is not one of those recognized investigators that pervades his series. So this is kind of a non-series book, and how it varies is that it is not just a murder mystery, but it's also a supernatural horror book. So it's gender crossing, and that is cool in a way, and also makes it quite confusing throughout. So 215 pages, there's a lot of characters, and it's hard to keep straight. And of course, the premise now in 2025 may seem a little bit ridiculous because the idea is that this witch is doing someone in rather than it is a crime. So it's interesting because looking back when he wrote this early 1900s, you're thinking, okay, is he going to try to pull off a supernatural kind of event, or is it just going to be a murder and that's a guise? And I'm not going to tell you which way it goes. I will tell you the most interesting factoids besides the introduction of the book. The introduction is quite interesting. It's this guy, and he sees a picture of a woman that was executed for witchcraft long before his wife was alive. And the picture looks like his wife, and the name is the same. And it's like this synchronicity kind of thing going on. And he's spooked out, and that's where it all starts off from. And that intro is quite, supernatural, and you're thinking, okay, this is going to be a horror book. But then later on down the road, you find out, okay, there's a murder, and they're trying to solve the murder. And people are saying that they saw a woman walk through a wall, and all of these weird things happening. A guy wanting to be buried in a regular coffin rather than a crypt, like an old wooden coffin, because of supernatural belief, and a body missing, some pieces of twine or rope that are tied up together in a witch's cradle, I think it was called. And the most interesting part, like I said, other than the intro, was the historical references to the witch executions in England prior to the United States. So if you're not familiar, the big witch hunt that happened in Massachusetts here in the United States was way later than the things that happened in England. And in England, you might think, well, it's all hocus pocus, but once they frame witchcraft the way they do in this book with history, it talks about how people created what were called love potions, right? To try to sway people into doing things that they wanted them to do for love or whatever. But then they also had what was called death potions. And death potions, you probably don't hear much about now or think of it, but it was basically like somebody making a mixture of something with arsenic or cyanide or some other kind of thing in it. And it was considered like witchcraft. It wasn't considered, just like modern murder mystery the way it is now. So that stuff was kind of categorized as things that witches did, and part of the reason why they were rounded up and questioned and waterboarded and all those things, because some of them were really poisoning people. And in these stories, they were poisoning like dozens of people in a village. And, and then you heard other stories like Hansel and Gretel where they're kidnapping kids and stuff. And part of that is so that they could use like their hair and things and spells. A lot of these death potions also included, hocus pocus spells and things of that nature where they used other instruments besides the actual potion and turned it into something, I guess, perhaps bigger than what a modern person would think that, hey, you're just poisoning somebody. But yeah, that aspect was really interesting. And it went on for several pages in the middle, these excerpts of historical references. And I always like the little tidbits in books. Sometimes they're better than the book themselves, right? The factorial references. Stephen King's good at doing that. He always bases it on a premise that's real. And so it gives a little bit more validity to the possibility that, okay, maybe this did involve witchcraft and maybe it is somewhat supernatural. But your logical side, especially being a modern day person in 2025, you're going, there's no way it could be anything supernatural. So the investigator goes down the road, comes up to his conclusions, and it seems wrapped up. And I will tell you, the epilogue kind of flips the whole thing on its head. So there's some shocks and turns involved in this, especially at the end. It can be a little long-winded. It can be confusing. It is interesting, especially from the historical witchcraft angle of it. It's a little muddled because it's not a pure supernatural horror story and it's not a pure murder story, but it may be as good as you could combine two of those genres by a good writer. Obviously, he's very thought out. And if you look at like Agatha Christie, one of the criticisms I've had of her books I've read of hers is that they're almost too simple. They're very quick reading and you can almost see it happening a mile away. Or if you can't, when you find out what it is, it's kind of ridiculous sometimes. This was super, super thought out. And it's almost so much thought out that you need to be an intellectual to keep track of all these different threads he's got going on. And I'm wondering now, the next books of his that I read, if they're going to be that deep. And I also wonder if this person was more geared towards people with high intellect rather than the average reader. And I'm not trying to diss myself, but it was hard to follow. And I'm an intelligent person. It was hard to follow. So there's people clearly that are probably more intelligent than I am. And I think one of them might be the guy that recommended this book series, but that will be to see if that's the case down the road when I read more of the John Dickson Carr books. If I find them confusing every time, then perhaps I'll know that it's just out of my bandwidth a little bit. So far, still, Perry Mason is my perfect combination of readability, but yet interesting enough to make it not stupid. Whereas Agatha Christie sometimes can be a little bit stupid. Perry Mason has enough detail to make it more thought out. This one was thought out maybe too much until you got to the epilogue, and it's kind of like, what? Where you don't really know what percentage of the situation involved the spiritual horror part of it as opposed to just pure facts. I guess I'll say it that way. And there was a lot of people in that time when this came out that were upset because the epilogue was like against some of the cardinal rules of murder mystery writing, I guess, in that they thought it was going to end up, wrapped up, and it kind of didn't. So it was kind of an open-ended ending. But still a good book, not a great book. Again, probably not the first one you want to read if you're going to start John Dickson Carr. But it could be if you're adventurous, I suppose. And I've given you enough forewarning that there are good factoids in it that you'll find interesting. So that's what you'll get out of it.